When the black majority in South Africa finally took political power in 1994, like the entire global community was basically bracing for a bloodbath.
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, everyone
Eh.
expected absolute chaos.
Right. Because if you look at the historical precedent for that kind of transition, an overwhelming majority population breaking free from decades of just brutal systemic oppression by a tiny elite minority, it almost always ends in mass confiscation of wealth.
Violent retribution.
Exactly, like the total destruction of the former ruling class. But that didn't happen.
No, it didn't.
There was no violent revenge. The property of the white elite was not seized. And to this day, it stands as one of the most staggering, sort of slap-in-the-face, counterintuitive historical mysteries of the 20th century.
And, the world watched that transition and immediately framed it as this massive triumph of the human spirit.
Which, I mean, it was in many ways.
Right, of course. The narrative we all internalize is that the sheer moral force of Nelson Mandela, combined with this miraculous wave of national forgiveness, somehow just bypassed human nature.
Yeah.
But while the cultural and human elements of that era are completely undeniable, viewing that transition purely as a moral victory kind of obscures the actual mechanics of how a country avoids tearing itself apart.
Okay, so today we are custom tailoring a deep dive for you that completely strips away that romanticized version of history. We are looking past the speeches, past the parades, and we are digging into the cold, hard economic math.
The underlying architecture of it all.
Exactly. Our source material today is an incredibly revealing working paper by two economists, Robert Inman, who is a finance professor at Wharton, and Daniel Rubenfeld, a law and economics professor at Berkeley.
And it's titled Understanding the Democratic Transition in South Africa.
Right. And the mission of this deep dive is to uncover the secret, literal hostage game that forced sworn enemies into a golden balance.
Because Inman and Rubenfeld, they approached the South African Constitution not as a political document, but as an economic equation.
Which is such a fascinating way to look at it.
It really is. They built a mathematical model to analyze the incentives of literally every player involved.
Yeah.
And what they reveal is that peace wasn't secured through goodwill.
Yeah?
Peace was secured because the architects of the transition built a self-enforcing trap, a system where both the historical oppressors and the historically oppressed held a gun to each other's economic heads.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand why the white elite ever agreed to step away from the levers of political power, we first have to shatter a massive illusion about the old regime.
The illusion of prosperity.
Right. There's this pervasive myth that keeping the system of apartheid going was, like, highly profitable for the white minority. People picture this ruthless but lucrative economic engine. But if you look at the data from the sources, the reality is just a complete financial collapse.
Yeah, the paper relies heavily on data from the Penn World Tables, which economists use to compare real GDP and income across countries over long stretches of time.
Okay.
And if you look at the baseline average growth rate for South Africa from 1950 to 1993, it was a sluggish 1.24%.
It's not great.
Not great at all. But the authors zero in on the late apartheid era, specifically 1977 to 1993. During those final 16 years, the economic engine didn't just slow down. It completely threw a rod.
Wow.
The real per capita GDP growth rate plummeted to negative 0.8%.
Wait, negative?
Negative 0.8%. The economy was actively shrinking and elite wealth was evaporating.
I want to break down exactly why that shrinkage was happening, because it wasn't just, a random recession. The authors point to two massive external forces crushing the regime. First, international trade sanctions.
Right.
By the late 70s and 80s, the global financial community was isolating South Africa. The paper calculates that sanctions alone were shaving nearly a full % off the annual growth rate.
Which is huge.
Foreign direct investment dried up, capital was fleeing the country, and the state was just locked out of global credit markets.
And the second force was internal, and mathematically it was even more devastating.
That's right.
Exactly. The paper models the impact of massive coordinated strikes by black unions, specifically the Congress of South African Trade Unions, or COSATU. As the government was forced into recognizing these majority-controlled unions, industrial action became this incredible weapon of economic paralysis.
Because a coordinated strike in the mining or manufacturing sectors, it doesn't just stop production for a day.
No, it disrupts entire supply chains. It absolutely terrifies investors. And the econometric model in the paper attributes a massive 1.88% drop in the annual growth rate directly to the constant threat and execution of these strikes.
So just think about what that means for a business owner or an elite investor living under that regime. Your international markets are closed, your workforce is repeatedly halting production, and your revenue is in free fall.
It's a nightmare.
But the real slap in the face is the cost of maintaining the physical infrastructure of apartheid. You can't enforce a deeply unpopular, violently oppressive system against a massive majority for free.
Definitely not.
The authors dug into the national budget data from that 1977 to 1993 window and found that the white elite was spending 33.7 billion rand in real year 2000 rand every single year.
33.7 billion.
Every single year.
And that money was allocated exclusively to the military, the police, and the prison system.
Just to keep the lid on.
Exactly. It was for the financial lifeblood required to maintain a police state. To put the scale of that into perspective, the authors define this as the deadweight loss of oppression.
Dead weight loss.
Right, because it is capital that produces absolutely nothing of economic value. It doesn't build roads, it doesn't fund research, it doesn't improve public health. It is purely an expenditure to prevent the collapse of the state.
I always picture this like a store owner in a neighborhood that has completely turned against them. The store used to turn a profit, but now the owner is spending 90% of their revenue just hiring armed mercenaries to stand at the windows so people don't burn the building down.
That's a perfect analogy.
At a certain point, you aren't running a business anymore. You are just funding a fortress. And eventually, you run out of money to pay the guards.
And that financial hemorrhage made the transition inevitable. A bloodless democratic transition wasn't just this moral awakening for the ruling class. It was a desperate financial bailout.
I needed it.
They needed to stop the strikes, lift the sanctions, and stop spending 33 billion rand a year on riot police.
Yeah.
But stepping out of the fortress introduced an entirely new existential terror.
The Zimbabwe nightmare.
Yes. The psychological impact of neighboring Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, really cannot be overstated when analyzing the South African transition.
Because they watched it happen next door.
Exactly. The white South African leadership watched the Rhodesian transition to majority rule, which eventually led to sweeping, uncompensated land confiscations and the total economic disenfranchisement of the white farming and business class.
And if you are analyzing this purely through game theory, the majority's incentive to confiscate property is just overwhelming. In a simple majority democracy with extreme wealth inequality, which South Africa had, with a tiny wealthy minority and a massive impoverished majority, the most logical, immediate political move for a newly elected government is to legally seize the assets of the rich.
Right, because you have millions of voters demanding housing, land, and capital.
And the ballot box gives you total control of the state apparatus. The temptation to simply vote to take the land, the mines, and the bank accounts is absolute.
And the paper highlights that for the elites, this was the ultimate sticking point. If the cost of democracy is losing 100% of your assets, you will fight to the death behind the walls of your bankrupt fortress.
Yeah, you have nothing left to lose.
So for a peaceful transition to occur, the elites required an ironclad guarantee, not a verbal promise from Mandela, but a structural mathematical guarantee embedded in the law that their wealth would not be wiped out.
So here is where it gets really interesting. Because you don't secure that kind of guarantee by asking the other side to sign a pledge. You secure it by building a constitutional trap.
The hostage game.
The hostage game. Inman and Rubenfeld call the resulting system the hostage game. When the negotiators sat down to write the new constitution, they specifically avoided creating a simple unitary democracy where the central government controls every lever of power.
Right.
Instead, they designed this masterpiece of mutually assured destruction.
And the mechanism they engineered was a highly specific federal system. Federalism inherently splits power between a national central government and regional or provincial government.
Sure.
But the genius of the South African model lies in exactly how those specific powers were divided.
Right. Who gets what?
Exactly. The central government, which everyone involved knew would be controlled by the African National Congress, the ANC, representing the vast black majority, was granted the power to set national tax rates.
Okay, so they control the revenue stream.
Yes. They decide how much capital gets extracted from the economy.
So the black majority is handed the tax lever, which is a massive economic weapon. But they didn't get everything.
No, they didn't. The Constitution assigned the responsibility for actually delivering redistributive public services, primary education, healthcare, housing construction, and social welfare transfers to the 9 provincial governments.
Interesting.
So the central government collects the taxes, but it is constitutionally mandated to share those revenues with the provinces who actually execute the services on the ground.
At first glance, that seems like a minor bureaucratic detail. I mean, if the ANC wins the national election and they win the provincial elections, they still control the whole board.
But this is where the paper reveals a mind-blowing geographic manipulation.
I love this part.
The borders of the provinces were not historical accidents. During the transition negotiations, the white elite, represented by the National Party, demanded that the borders of the Western Cape province be drawn with surgical precision.
Surgical precision.
The demographic math behind the Western Cape's borders is a phenomenal example of defensive gerrymandering. The negotiators took the adult population data at the time. Nationwide, there were roughly 9.6 million white and elite minority adults, compared to over 25 million black majority citizens.
Okay.
They meticulously carved out a geographic zone for the Western Cape, where non-ANC voters, a coalition of white elites, the Centrist Democratic Alliance, and other minority groups made up exactly 51% of the electorate.
Wait, exactly 51%.
Exactly 51%.
Just think about the sheer audacity of that, 51%. They engineered a legal fortress right in the geography of the new democracy.
Yep.
Inside this meticulously drawn province, there were about 4.8 million elite voters and 4.6 million majority voters. By locking in that 51% majority, they intentionally designed a province where the historical oppressors would maintain legal democratic control over the regional government.
And by controlling that specific regional government, the white elites maintained direct administrative control over the hospitals, the schools, the police, and the housing infrastructure for the millions of poor black residents living inside the borders of the Western Cape.
Wow.
They held the service delivery hostage.
I have to push back on the viability of this trap, though. Let's look at this from the perspective of the ANC central government. You control the national tax revenue. You control the national military. You represent the overwhelming majority of the country.
Right.
Why wouldn't you just pass a federal law abolishing the provincial borders or fire the elite provincial leaders? I mean, why play along and allow this one province to hold out as a political anomaly?
And the paper answers that with brutal economic logic. The ANC didn't crush the Western Cape because the black majority desperately needed something the white elite possessed.
Which was?
Administrative efficiency. Decades of apartheid had deliberately starved the black population of higher education and technical training. And the legacy of that systemic deprivation was a massive, quantifiable disparity in human capital.
The researchers actually put number to this disparity, and they are stark. At the time of the transition, the white elite public employees, the civil engineers, the hospital administrators, the tax accountants running the Western Cape, had an average of 17 years of education.
17 years.
By contrast, the trained black public employees had an average of 14 years, and the vast majority of untrained black employees had only about 7 years of formal education.
And Inman and Rubenfeld took those education disparities and translated them into the actual cost of government operations.
Oh, wow.
They calculated the cost of delivering a standardized unit of public service. Let's define a unit as a specific standard of healthcare provision or a year of primary education.
Okay.
In the elite-run Western Cape, delivering that unit of service cost the government 4,706 rand.
Because the highly educated bureaucrats knew how to run procurement, manage logistics, minimize administrative waste.
Exactly. But in the majority-run provinces, which were struggling to build infrastructure and train administrators from scratch after decades of engineered poverty, delivering that exact same unit of service cost a massive 5,714 rand.
Wait, 5,714 rand. That is a staggering difference.
It is.
You are looking at a markup of over 20% just in sheer inefficiency.
Yes, and if the ANC central government decided to declare a purely unitary state, abolishing the provinces and taking direct federal control over the Western Cape's hospitals and schools, they would instantly lose that efficiency discount.
Because the elite bureaucrats would just leave.
They would simply quit. They would take their 17 years of education into the private sector, or they would emigrate to London or Sydney.
And the model projects that the cost to provide basic survival services to the poor majority nationwide would skyrocket. The ANC realized that allowing the elites to run the Western Cape meant they could deliver better, cheaper schools and clinics to the black residents living within that province.
Right. The white elites couldn't be easily replaced without bankrupting the state's social programs. Efficiency was the hostage the elites held.
So we have this perfectly balanced standoff. The ANC looks at the Western Cape and says, We won't abolish your province because we need your administrative machinery to run our programs cheaply.
Yeah.
But the ANC still holds the ultimate trump card taxes.
Right.
The elites hold the services hostage, but the majority holds the capital hostage. This brings us to a fascinating economic tension. If you are the ANC and your entire political mandate is to redistribute wealth to an impoverished population, how high do you push the tax rate on the wealthy elites before the whole system snaps?
And the authors dive deeply into the concept of the Laffer curve to explain the central government's constraints.
Okay, remind us how that works.
So for those unfamiliar, the Laffer curve is an economic principle illustrating that tax rates and tax revenues do not scale infinitely together. If a government sets the tax rate at 0%, they collect zero revenue.
Obviously.
If they set the tax rate at 100%, they also collect zero revenue because no one will work or everyone will just hide their income.
Right.
Somewhere in the middle is the peak, the absolute maximum amount of money a government can extract before behavior changes.
And the paper models this specific curve for the South African elites. Inman and Rubenfeld analyzed the elasticity of taxable income and capital flight patterns. They calculated that the absolute mathematical peak of the Laffer curve for the white elite was 32,000 rand per person.
32,000.
If the central government demanded 32,001 rand, total tax revenues would actually drop. The elites would accelerate offshore tax avoidance, shut down businesses, and move their capital out of the country. 32,000 rand is the physical limit of the golden goose.
And knowing that limit, you would logically assume the ANC would target exactly 32,000 rand.
Right, why wouldn't they?
I mean, they had millions of constituents living in informal settlements without running water. The political pressure to extract every single available cent from the former oppressors was immense.
But the historical data reveals a totally counterintuitive outcome. The ANC did not max out the taxes. The two sides settled into a long-term equilibrium where the effective tax rate on the elites was capped at 29,600 rand.
They intentionally stopped short of the cliff.
By locking in at 29,600 rand instead of the maximum 32,000, the white elites effectively secured a 7.5% discount off their maximum possible tax burden. Both sides silently agreed to leave capital on the table.
Which requires a deep explanation because politically, it makes no sense.
None at all.
Why would a liberation movement leave 7.5% of available elite wealth untouched when their own voters are starving? What invisible force prevented the ANC from grabbing that last few thousand rand?
Yeah, what held them back?
The invisible force was the elite's ultimate retaliatory weapon. We discussed efficiency as a passive hostage, but the elites also designed an active mechanism for punishment.
Oh, boy.
Inman and Rubenfeld defined this mechanism as high capture. To understand high capture, you have to look at how federal money actually flows through the plumbing of the state.
Okay, let's trace the money. The central government collects the income taxes, and then, as dictated by the Constitution, they distribute block grants back down to the provinces to fund the schools and hospitals.
Right.
The central government sets national standards. They dictate that a clinic must have a certain number of doctors or a school must meet specific curriculum requirements. The Western Cape receives the grant and complies with those standards.
But the federal grant sent to the province is mathematically designed to be slightly larger than the absolute minimum required to meet those national standards.
So there's extra.
There is always a pool of leftover money. The economists refer to this as unconstrained funds or discretionary provincial revenue.
Unconstrained funds, meaning money that isn't legally earmarked for a specific syringe or a specific textbook.
Precisely. If the ANC betrayed the unspoken agreement and cranked the national tax rate up to the maximum 32,000 rand limit, the white bureaucrats controlling the Western Cape would trigger high capture.
Which means what?
They would legally intercept those unconstrained funds, money fundamentally intended to help lift the black majority out of poverty and aggressively reallocate it.
Wait, explain the day-to-day mechanics of capture. How do bureaucrats legally funnel welfare funds into elite pockets without violating the Constitution?
It happens entirely within the boundaries of administrative discretion.
Okay.
The provincial government has the power to allocate its administrative budget, its infrastructure maintenance, and its discretionary spending. Under high capture, the Western Cape government could funnel up to 85% of all unconstrained funds directly into the specific municipalities where the 51% elite voting bloc resides.
Oh my God.
They prioritize repaving center city roads over building water infrastructure in the townships. They allocate discretionary technology grants to elite suburban high schools while leaving rural majority schools with the bare constitutional minimum.
It is a legal, bureaucratic starvation tactic.
Exactly.
If the ANC maxed out taxes, the elites would retaliate by cutting off all surplus welfare and discretionary spending for the black majority living inside the Western Cape. It is the definition of mutually assured destruction. The central government taxes the elites to the limit, and the elites capture 85% of the welfare surplus.
And the threat of high capture is what kept the central government's hand off the tax dial. The ANC recognized that pushing the elites to 32,000 Rand would trigger a devastating collapse in living standards for their own constituents in the Cape.
So the system is just balanced on the absolute edge of a knife.
It really is.
But there is a secondary mechanism here that is even more fascinating. To keep this terrifying machinery from rusting shut, the authors reveal that the architects of the transition designed a secret reservoir.
The secret reservoir.
They realized that you can't just threaten people constantly, you know? You have to give them a daily incentive to play the game.
And the paper refers to this as the gray lubricant of the new democracy. To keep the highly educated white elite engaged in managing the provincial government, the central government implicitly permitted a low, continuous level of legal capture to occur every single year.
It was baked in.
It was baked into the economic equilibrium.
Let's look at the numbers behind the secret reservoir because this is crazy. The authors analyzed the budget data and found that the central government transferred roughly 500 Rand per capita of these unconstrained funds into the Western Cape annually.
500 Rand.
If you scale that up, it translates to roughly $435 million a year in discretionary funding floating around the province.
And the unwritten rule of the hostage game dictated that the white elites were allowed to quietly skim about 15% of that unconstrained money. They operated at a low capture rate.
So roughly $65 million a year was legally diverted. The ANC federal government looked the other way, while the elites utilized that 15% to polish their own infrastructure, fund their own community projects, and keep their wealthy constituents pacified.
Yeah, they let it slide.
The ANC accepted this 15% leakage as the administrative fee for keeping the highly efficient white bureaucrats in the system. And in exchange, the elites accepted the new high tax regime because they were receiving this secret reservoir of funds, and their overall tax burden was kept 7.5% below the maximum limit.
It is a phenomenal example of a self-enforcing contract. Both sides found an equilibrium where breaking the rules was mathematically more painful than maintaining the compromise.
It's brilliant.
But we've mapped out how the trap was built conceptually. Observing how it functioned in reality, specifically during the presidency of Nelson Mandela, reveals the true political genius of the era.
Mandela's early decisions, when viewed through the lens of this economic model, are a massive historical bombshell.
Oh, absolutely.
When Mandela took office in 1994, he was carrying the weight of tens of millions of impoverished, deeply traumatized citizens. His political base was demanding immediate, sweeping financial relief. You would expect a newly empowered liberation leader to turn the dial of wealth redistribution all the way to the maximum limit on day one.
And the paper quantifies this dynamic using a variable they call the Q value.
The Q value.
The Q value represents the centrally mandated level of redistributive services forced upon the provinces. It is essentially a dial measuring how much elite wealth is being aggressively pushed down to the poor majority.
Okay.
Inman and Rubenfeld calculated what the black majority's minimally acceptable level of redistribution would be, like the lowest possible threshold of wealth transfer they would tolerate before deciding the democratic experiment was a failure and demanding a revolutionary takeover.
So, measuring against that minimally acceptable expectation, what did Mandela's government actually deliver in those first critical years?
In the budgets from 1995 through 1999, the actual redistribution transferred by Mandela's central government was only about 75% of the minimum amount his own base expected.
Wait, 75% of the minimum?
Yes. He intentionally kept the Q value hovering around a moderate 0.54.
He intentionally underdelivered to the very people who suffered under apartheid to put him in power.
Yeah.
The political courage required to do that is almost unfathomable, but the economic logic behind it is just brilliant. By holding back the redistribution dial, by keeping taxes below the limit, and by initially allowing generous block grants to flow into the Western Cape, Mandela was sending a massive, flashing neon signal to the white elites and the global financial markets.
It was a profound act of anti-majoritarian restraint.
Anti-majoritarian restraint, I like that.
Mandela was actively proving to the historical oppressors that the ANC could be trusted with the keys to the economy. He was demonstrating that the Zimbabwe scenario was not going to happen in South Africa.
Because if he had entered office and immediately demanded maximum wealth extraction.
The elites would have panicked. They would have activated high capture, liquidated their assets, and fled the country, triggering a total currency collapse.
And because he possessed such unquestionable moral authority with the black majority, Mandela was the only human being on Earth who could tell them to wait a little longer. He bought the new economy time to take root.
And the dividend that paid out because of that restraint is staggering. If you look at the macroeconomic data post-transition, the pie didn't just stabilize, it grew.
The reversal is dramatic. Remember, late apartheid GDP was shrinking by 0.8% a year. Between 1993 and 2007, under the mechanics of the hostage game, the South African economy grew at an average annual rate of 2.65%.
You're over 2.5%.
Real incomes increased by roughly 2% per year across all percentiles of the income distribution. The national poverty rate dropped significantly, falling from 31% down to 23%.
Which brings us to a mathematical conclusion that completely short-circuits my brain. I want to synthesize exactly what this means for the individuals involved.
Yeah.
The white elite agreed to surrender their monopoly on political power.
Right.
They agreed to be heavily taxed by the very population they used to brutally oppress.
Yes.
And as a direct result of that surrender, they got much, much richer.
Wait, really?
The researchers ran a comprehensive 70-year projection model to calculate the lifetime economic net benefit of the democratic transition. They factored in the new redistributive tax burdens against a massive growth dividend created by ending the strikes, lifting the international sanctions, and eliminating the 33 billion rand annual cost of the police state.
Okay, so what was the number?
For an individual in the white elite, their lifetime net benefit from democracy was projected at an astounding 412,922 rand.
412,000 rand. They made over 400,000 rand ahead by surrendering the fortress.
Exactly.
And what about the black majority? What was their calculated benefit from participating in this highly constrained federal system?
For a typical resident in the black majority, the federal hostage game generated a projected lifetime net benefit of 161,393 rand.
So 161,000. The system literally printed wealth for both sides.
It did.
But here is the detail that truly proves the genius of the constitutional design. That 161,393 rand benefit for the poor majority under the federal compromise is actually higher than the wealth they would have generated if they had seized absolute unconstrained power.
Yeah, the economists modeled a counterfactual scenario where the ANC establishes a purely unitary state, abolishing the provinces, eliminating the elite bureaucrats in the Western Cape, and taxing the wealthy at the absolute maximum.
Total domination.
Total domination.
Yeah.
And in that scenario, the lifetime benefit for the majority drops to 154,329 rand.
Wow. Because without the elite administrators running the logistics, the cost of building schools and delivering medicine skyrockets, eating up all the extra tax revenue they managed to squeeze out of the rich. The federal compromise physically generated more wealth for the poor than total conquest ever could. It is the most profound, mathematically proven argument for political compromise I've ever seen.
It worked brilliantly, as long as everyone played their part. But the structural vulnerability of the hostage game is that it requires all participants to be what economists define as patient players.
Patient players.
A patient player is willing to look at a 70-year horizon and accept a slower rate of wealth accumulation today in exchange for systemic stability tomorrow.
And patience is a luxury. I mean, if you are an elite banker in Cape Town, it's easy to be patient. But if you are living in a tin shack in a township and it's been over a decade since the end of apartheid and you are still waiting for running water while you watch the white elites getting richer off the growth dividend, your patience is going to evaporate.
Oh, absolutely. By 2006, the timeline of patience had essentially run out. Nelson Mandela's chosen successor, President Thabo Mbeki, had largely continued Mandela's centrist, cautious macroeconomic policies for the first 5 years of his presidency.
Right.
He kept the Q dial low. He kept the system perfectly balanced. But a massive political current was building within the ANC. The rank-and-file members, spearheaded by COSATU, the exact same trade unions that paralyzed the apartheid economy and the ANC Youth League, reached a boiling point.
They were done waiting.
They demanded an end to the cautious equilibrium. They demanded that the central government crank up the redistribution dial.
And the political pressure on Mbeki must have been crushing. He is forced to respond to the anger of his own base.
Yeah.
So we look back at that Q value, the mandated level of wealth transfer. How drastically did Mbeki shift the policy?
Over his final three budgets, Mbeki was forced to push that Q value significantly higher, moving it from the moderate 0.61 up to 0.79.
From 0.61 to
It
0.79.
was a massive, sudden acceleration in mandated service delivery.
He essentially increased the mandated wealth transfer by nearly 30% in just a few years. But it wasn't enough to save him. The rank and file viewed his concessions as too little, too late. In December 2007, at the ANC National Convention, Mbeki was ousted as the leader of the party in a brutal internal power struggle. He was forced to resign the national presidency the following year, paving the way for Jacob Zuma.
And Jacob Zuma represents an entirely different era of the hostage game. He rose to power specifically as the champion of the impatient rank and file.
Right, the populist wave.
He rode a wave of populist frustration, and his mandate was to extract maximum wealth for the base, regardless of the delicate constitutional equilibrium.
So Zuma takes control of the economic levers, and he immediately starts pushing the Q dial higher. According to The Economist's modeling of his 2009-2010 budgets, Zuma pushed the Q value to 0.85.
0.85.
To understand why that specific number, 0.85, is the focal point of the paper's warning, we have to look at the physical limits of the math. Why does the model start flashing red at 0.85?
It goes back to the mechanics of the secret reservoir. Remember that the unconstrained funds, the leftover money that the white elites in the Western Cape are allowed to skim their 15% from, only exist if the central government sends more money to the province than is strictly required to meet the mandated Q level of services.
If the Q requirement is low, the federal grant covers the schools and hospitals, and there's a big pile of cash left over for the reservoir.
Exactly. But as Zuma cranks the Q value up to 0.85, the legal mandate for core services becomes so expensive that almost every single rand the central government transfers to the Western Cape must be spent just to hit the legal target.
So there's no extra.
The surplus evaporates. The unconstrained funds shrink almost to zero.
And if the reservoir dries up, the entire mechanism of mutually assured destruction goes offline.
Precisely. If there are no unconstrained funds, the elite's 15% legal capture becomes 15% of nothing. They lose their incentive to participate. But vastly more important is the loss of their weapon. The punishment for central government betrayal was high capture the threat that the elites would capture 85% of the unconstrained funds and starve the black majority in the province.
Wow, okay. So if Zuma raises the Q target so high that there are no unconstrained funds,
Yeah.
the elites have nothing left to capture. Their gun is suddenly empty.
Yes. And Inman and Rubenfeld calculated the absolute maximum Q value the system can sustain before the hostage game entirely breaks down. That mathematical cliff is 0.86.
0.86.
At a 0.86, the unconstrained funds hit absolute zero.
Yeah.
The elites completely lose their ability to execute high capture. And the moment the elites lose their threat, the central government has absolutely no rational reason to hold back on taxes.
Oh, God, man.
The ANC will instantly blow past the 29,600 Rand equilibrium and tax the elites to the absolute maximum limit of 32,000 Rand because the punishment mechanism no longer exists.
So Zuma pushed the dial to 0.85. He parked the South African economy 1 millimeter from the edge of the cliff.
Right on the edge.
The bargaining range between what the impoverished majority demands for survival and what the wealthy elite will tolerate before fleeing has been squeezed to nothing. So if the model says the limit is 0.86 and they're sitting at 0.85, does the paper suggest they are inevitably going to cross the line? What are the actual projections for South Africa's future?
The authors lay out three distinct, mathematically projected paths for the country moving forward. The model views these as a three-pronged crossroads, and each path represents a radically different future.
Let's walk through the economist's projections. What is path number one?
The first path relies on the rapid expansion of the black middle class. In this scenario, the ANC leadership manages to appease the impatient factions without pushing the Q dial any higher. They freeze it at 0.85.
Okay.
The goal is to stall long enough for economic growth to lift a critical mass of the black majority into the middle class. Once they enter the middle class, their economic incentives shift. They become property owners, business owners, and taxpayers.
Right, they have a stake in the game now.
They begin to advocate for lower taxes and macroeconomic stability, effectively aligning their interests with the historical elites to preserve the system.
You essentially grow the pie fast enough that the anger subsides. But given the severe headwinds in the global economy over the last decade, relying entirely on rapid, uninterrupted GDP growth is a massive gamble. What is path two?
The model projects path two as a scenario of increased state friction. If the central government cannot deliver more wealth because they mathematically cannot push Q past 0.86 without breaking the economy, and the impoverished majority continues to aggressively protest for housing and services,
What happens?
the state will be forced to utilize suppression. The ANC would have to massively expand the police apparatus to crush the protests of their own political base. The government born out of liberation would become the militant enforcers of an economic ceiling that fundamentally protects the wealth of the historical elites.
That is a staggering paradox. The liberators forced to rebuild the fortress to protect the hostage game. And then there is Path 3, the path where they step over the red line.
Path 3 is the systemic collapse model. The populist pressure from the rank and file becomes overwhelming. The ANC leadership decides they cannot politically survive shooting their own voters in the streets, so they capitulate.
They turn the dial.
They push the Q value past 0.86. They break the constitutional boundaries, moving the country toward a de facto unitary state, and they crank the tax rate up to the maximum 32,000 Rand limit.
The unconstrained funds hit zero. The elite's weapon is neutralized. The hostage game shatters.
The model projects that the white elites, realizing their structural protection is gone, will activate massive capital flight. Tax evasion will spike, foreign investment will plummet, and the highly educated bureaucrats running the provincial systems will leave the public sector.
To a brain drain.
The efficiency of public services will collapse, eating whatever extra tax revenue the government managed to extract. The country descends into economic chaos. The exact tragedy they spent the 1990s meticulously engineering a constitution to avoid finally comes to pass.
It is genuinely chilling to see how fragile the line between prosperity and collapse truly is. We started this deep dive by asking how South Africa managed a transition without a bloodbath. It happened because the architects built a perfectly balanced economic bomb where neither side could press the detonator without blowing themselves up.
Exactly.
But we are leaving with a much darker question. How long can that mathematical balance survive when millions of people are still suffering at the bottom of the equation?
And, the ultimate takeaway from Inman and Rubenfeld's work connects to a broader political science concept known as Weingast's rule.
Weingast's rule.
Barry Weingast theorized that most constitutions written throughout history are fundamentally useless. Words on a page do not stop bullets, and they do not suppress greed. A constitution only functions if it is what he calls self-enforcing.
The rules have to protect themselves mechanically.
For any constitution to survive, it must create a scenario where the short-term temptation to violate the rules is mathematically outweighed by the long-term benefit of upholding them. South Africa survived the initial transition, not simply because Nelson Mandela was a visionary leader, but because the federal system they engineered was a perfectly self-enforcing hostage game. The math literally forced enemies to cooperate.
If you are listening to this right now, you might be wondering why a dense econometric analysis of 1990 South African tax policy matters to your life today. I think it is profoundly relevant because you can look out your window and see expanding wealth gaps, extreme political polarization, and rising populist anger happening in democracies all over the globe.
Oh, everywhere.
In so many of our modern societies, we rely almost entirely on historical norms, goodwill, and handshakes to keep the system running. We operate on the assumption that the ultra-rich won't exploit the working class to the point of starvation, and we hope the working class won't eventually vote to burn the entire system to the ground. But the South African model proves that when inequality becomes absolute, morals are completely insufficient. You need mutual leverage.
Yeah. The paper forces you to look at the structure of your own economy and ask an incredibly uncomfortable question.
What's that?
In a modern era of globalized capital, do the ultra-rich and the working class actually hold enough of each other's hostages to force cooperation? Or has one side accumulated so much frictionless power that the game is effectively over?
If South Africa teaches us anything, it is that peace is not simply the absence of violence. Peace is a highly calibrated, desperately maintained mathematical equation. And if you push the numbers too far, the entire structure shatters. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the hidden mechanics beneath the history, and we will see you on the next deep dive.